So I'm Janeen Hayat. I'm Director of Collective Action at the FEA, and I'm going to talk to you about the report card. We've heard a little bit about it already. So last week, we launched our annual report card, and that is our State of the Nation on Educational Inequality in England. And you've seen a bit about the disadvantage gaps already, but our report card measures where our progress is at against these 5 aspects of the disadvantage gap. So this year's report card, entitled Achieving a Fair Education in England, is a milestone because it marked 10 years of the impact goals. So it's a really good point for us to stop, look at the progress we've made so far, where we're at now, and where we should go next. So we worked with the Center for Education and Youth on that 10-year look back and the 2022 snapshot. And I think Joe, Baz, and Vanessa are here at the moment. So big thank you to you guys at CFEY. It's amazing to work with you. I'd also like to say a big thank you to Alan and Overy, who did all of the graphic design work for our report card. And we are so grateful and excited about how it looks, which always helps get the message across. So the challenge that the report card presents us is daunting. We will hear shortly about rising poverty rates and the pressure that the current cost of living crisis is putting on schools and on the families served by schools. And it's in that context that we find that 2 out of 5 of the gaps measured by the impact goals are at their highest rates since 2012, and a third gap has actually increased since 2012. So if you see here, the top one, Key Stage 2, is the end of primary school. You'll see that the disadvantage gap was already growing in 2018 before the pandemic, and same with Key Stage 4 at GCSE, but then you see that really sharp climb in the last couple of years. And in the last couple of years, we've also seen other disparities widen as well. So students learning English as an additional language, students with SEND, both of those are seeing greater gaps, and we're also seeing regional disparities grow. And then the gap that actually got wider in the last 10 years was in progression to university. So there are more people across the board going to university, but the gap between those eligible for free school meals and others actually grew slightly. And what's not shown on that graph is that the gap was even wider for the most highly selective universities. So the last one I'll touch on is impact goal 3, which we've always found a bit tricky to measure. That's social and emotional skills and well-being. And that's because we haven't had enough consistent data to fully understand the picture over the past decade, and that in itself is an illustration of the problem. Something we do know is that young people from poorer families and those with SEND have failed to bounce back from pandemic lows at the same rate as others, and that both poverty and being LGBTQ+ significantly increase vulnerability to poor well-being. So we need better data to understand the nuance within that, and we need to start taking it really seriously. However, despite the current state, to say that we haven't made progress is wrong, because we have. We have made progress due to the work of all of you in this room. Owing to that, we've improved the outcomes for millions of children across the country. But the problem is that hasn't been as widespread as it needs to be, and it's been diluted by external forces and by policy decisions. So that's why in this year's report card, the recommendations we're making try to address the root causes of that inequality, as well as some of the systemic challenges that exacerbate it. The power of the FEA is that so many solutions exist within our membership, and the recommendations we make here come from many of the people in this room, from our members. So specifically, Bite Back, the Child Poverty Action Group, Teach First, Be Well, ASCL, NEHT, the EDGE Foundation, and Campaign for Learning. So I'll start with 3 big themes, and you'll notice that these also underpin our program today: poverty, place, and power. And these are things that will enable or hinder our progress, depending on whether we get them right. So in the report card, we call on the government to do more to insulate schools and the pupils within them from the cost of living crisis, and to target its spending towards those in greatest need. So that includes a school funding index, an extension of free school meals to all children in poverty, an extension of the pupil premium, and targeting the investments we are making, like the National Tutoring Program, towards those who most need it. And that's something our Tuition Advocacy Working Group has been relentlessly demanding. For PLACE, we're calling for the endowment of a National Learning Center for PLACE to better understand what works in community-led change and to spread that best practice around. And to establish a body to survive political cycles and support the long-term change communities need. And then finally, we also need to consider who holds power in the system and to cede more of it to the young people experiencing the education system right now and to value that experience. So you've seen our 4 priorities, and we're also making a recommendation against each of those. So we're calling for a comprehensive national data system of pupil well-being. This would be a huge step forward in taking well-being as seriously as we do attainment, and Be Well has been a brilliant example of how this can be done. We've also heard from our members that too many families are unable to engage with their children's learning because their own basic needs aren't being met. And many of the services there to support them are underfunded or aren't working together. So we're calling for a plan to join up education, social care, housing, mental health, and other locally delivered services to put the family at the center. We're also calling for school accountabilities that recognize the complexity schools in underserved communities face. So that means that factors like inclusion should be part of what we consider in monitoring a school's success. And then finally, we need to ensure that every young person has a pathway to meaningful work, including those with low academic attainment. So we're asking for BTECs to be maintained alongside T-levels, for the apprenticeship levy to be refocused on 16 to 24s to create an additional pathway into careers, and for more support for small businesses to participate in apprenticeships. So I have seen many of you sharing the report card, and that's been fantastic, and it's my hope that you continue to use the data within it as your own and to piggyback on the recommendations where they align with your own work, and I think there is a lot of alignment with the work that you're all doing in the room. Let's make the case for bold and transformational change, because there is momentum gathering for that. We've seen it with the Times Educational Commission. We've seen it with the Foundation for Educational Development. More and more of us are demanding that long-term change, and we have the ideas in this room, so let's take them forward together. So, it's my pleasure to introduce our first panel of the day on responding to rising poverty. Poverty is something that has been seen perhaps outside of our purview in the education sector, but we can't afford to see it as anyone else's concern any longer. It's a large and growing barrier for the children we seek to serve. So for this panel, we are joined by Jehan Chaudhri, Family Support Officer at Clapham Manor Primary School and Nursery, where she directly supports families by forging those links between the education system, housing, and social care. Sir Tim Brighouse, who's had a long and influential career in education, including as the Schools Commissioner for London, where he led the successful London Challenge, and more recently, he co-authored a book with Mick Waters about our schools improving on previous best. And then we also have as chair Zulum Elumogo, a special advisor at Freuds Communications, FEA trustee, and a tireless advocate for broadening access to the arts and education. We're also meant to be joined by Abby Jitendra from the Joseph Roundtree Foundation. She's unfortunately unwell today, so I'm going to do my best to give you a bit of facts about the current state of poverty and where we're going, and hopefully you'll be forgiving. So, without further ado, I'll turn over to you, Zulum.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you this fine morning. Despite the difficult subject matter, of course, times are not easy. We've got the cost of living crisis, record inflation, recovery from COVID-19, and real terms cuts in public spending. The sector is facing myriad challenges. And despite England's fantastic start to the World Cup, those challenges persist. Who would have known? And to be honest, this panel is about one thing. How do we maximize? This day is about one thing. This organization is about one thing. How do we maximize absolutely every child's potential? How do we realize it? And it's very hard to realize your potential when you are hungry, when you live in substandard housing, where the ventilation in that housing can lead to, lung infections or mold that leads to early death. These things need to be solved, and they can be solved, and it's an aberration that in a country as rich and wealthy and as innovative as ours, that these situations still persist. So this panel, I'm wonderful to have you all here. It's about the who, what, and why this happens and how we can move forward so that every child's potential has been established. So starting off with Janeen, thank you for standing in firstly. The chairs are comfy, aren't they?
Oh, nice. I know, I was slouching a bit, wasn't it?
Back straight. What is the current state of poverty in England?
So, what was really interesting when I read Joseph Rantry's recent report from the summer was that over the past 10 years, it is just as much that we've seen poverty grow that we've seen poverty deepen. So we saw poverty deepening in that it was becoming more profound leading up to the pandemic, and then that was dramatically worsened by the pandemic and now by the cost of living crisis. So we went into those crises in bad shape, and then they made it much worse. So a few facts that between 2010 and 2019, so pre-pandemic, rough sleeping doubled. Between 2017 and 2019, the number of people in destitution rose by 54%. So destitution is not being able to feed yourself, stay warm and dry, or keep clean.
Wow.
And then as we look back in the years, in the decade from the pandemic and before, from 2003 to 2022, the proportion of people in very deep poverty has risen by a fifth, from 8% to 10%. So that's 10% of people in the country in very deep poverty. And the recorded diagnosis of malnutrition among people admitted to hospital tripled between 2008 and 2021. And so as we are still probably in the foothills of a cost of living crisis, we saw inflation hit 11.1% last week. We're not entering the cost of living crisis in a very secure state, and it's pushing more and more people who were on the margins into destitution or very deep poverty.
Yeah. Wow, thank you, Janeen, for the top line statistics. Now, of course, statistics tell one story, but the lived experience on the ground is super important and really does make it real. So, Jehan, thank you for being with us. I want to ask you, how have you seen the pandemic and now rising poverty impact the peoples of Clapham Manor and their families where you work?
Okay, so I'm going to start with an activity because I figured the best way for me to describe this is for everybody to actually live it as we do every day. I want you to take just maybe a few seconds on your table to talk to each other. This is a child who has everything they need. They're satisfied, they're content, as they can be, on their way into school each morning. Can you just discuss amongst yourselves what it is that they have that means that they're happy, content, satisfied? And I'm going to ask for feedback just from some of the tables about what those, so what are the basic needs that a child wants and needs
So a
as they go in?
A couple minutes and we'll come back. Well done. Really well done. That's good.
I need
Nice
to
job.
cough. How'd you cough without a mic?
You have to take it down.
I was trying so hard while you were talking. I was like, don't cough. How many?
We'll just get some mics to run, but Gina's not.
I mean, they can shout. It's fine.
Not everyone's a teacher.
How long do we have each? About 2 minutes more?
Yeah, 2 minutes. That's okay. I'll keep the time.
Think we're good to go?
You lead it. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. If I can just ask everybody to come back, and is anybody brave enough to share what they've come up with? Somebody? Fantastic, thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? Anything else? I mean, that covers most of it, but... So, fed, loved, clean clothes, healthy, happy, safe, and they've slept. Okay. That's a really good starting point because basically for quite a lot of the children that we have in our school, bear in mind our primary school is in Clapham, it's not the most deprived area in the country by any means, but for a lot of those children, they start their day without any of those things. And that is increasing, the number of children that we see. I'm going to give you the example of a child that we currently have in our year 5. So she's 9 years old. Her mum's not very well. She has medical issues that we all know the pressure that the NHS is under. So her mum's not being attended to. She's her sole carer. This is having an effect on this child getting into school each day. Attendance is very low. She misses the morning every morning. The morning is the bit where maths and English happens. So we already know what's happening to her academic attainment. You've spoken a lot today about well-being and then talking about skills and then talking about attainment. And I think how that resonated with me is that we're starting at a point where well-being isn't okay. So how do we move on to the rest of the items? She has a sibling who's older, who had an issue at school. Mum isn't able to go to the school to sort that out, so she now has a sibling that's 4 years older than her who also isn't in school. You mentioned motivation this morning. That hit home because that child doesn't have that motivation at home. She doesn't have enough food. When I first met them and started my role, they didn't have a fridge. I had to apply to a fund that works locally in Clapham, a relief fund, to get them a fridge. I then realised that they didn't actually have beds. That same fund can't give more than one item per household. And as you can imagine, as I'm applying for all of these things, it's taking time. I'm an adult who isn't in class. Our school is very fortunate that they have a family support worker because a class teacher wouldn't have the time or the resource to be able to organise all of this. You've spoken about properties not being fit for purpose. I would say housing is one of our biggest issues at the moment. I am consistently writing letters to housing, sending photos. People are not making things up. It's dire. On a lot of our days, Tim just said to me, you seem very enthusiastic and happy this morning. I'd like to describe my job at the moment as a NutriBullet. We go in, we spin, we do what we can, clutch at straws, and then we come out at the end of the day. And at the end of every day, I know I've done my best, but it's nowhere near enough. Those are the families where we can identify through poor attendance, low achievement, what's going on for them. We're not talking about the reception classes at the moment that are starting school. We've got a whole generation, last year and this year, post-pandemic, who are not school ready. They're not toilet trained. They haven't had needs identified because they haven't been able to access health visiting, maternal services, all the things that start before you go to school. So it starts very early on. We're playing catch up, as everybody is, and we're having to juggle daily what safeguarding means. You've got your obvious, immediate safeguarding concerns, but I would say a lot of this sits under safeguarding. Children aren't safe. I think you mentioned safe as one of your items. So the question there is, how much can we expect, given what is really on the ground going on for children as they're coming into school each morning, if they're even able to get into school?
Thank you, Jehan.
Okay.
So Tim, thank you for being here. How have you seen past economic cycles impact the education system?
Gosh, I don't want to answer that now. Not after what you've said. I want to start with a very quick comment before I turn to your question.
Please.
Which is this. Everybody in this room will be familiar with that story about the two people who walk along the beach and they see starfish, and one of them keeps bending down and throwing it into the sea again, and the other one keeps saying to them after a while, I don't know why you do that. It's not making any difference. Whereupon the first person bends down, throws the starfish into the sea and says, well, it's made a difference to that one. Now, you'll be familiar with it, and it's always struck me, as I was listening to your story about the starfish, because that's what you were describing, that all of us have to do that, depending on where we are, but it mustn't allow us to lose sight that if we built some breakwaters, there wouldn't be so many starfish for you to keep picking them up and throwing them into the beach. And it isn't simply that the breakwaters are national. There are breakwaters for Clapham. I remember when I went to London, David Blunkett and Estelle Morris said to me, we want you to do in London what you did in Birmingham. And I said, well, it wouldn't work in London because the context is quite different. So there are things that are general, but there are things that are different. So back to your question, have there been times like this? Well, I think the closest time, and it's a point of desperation and of hope, is that the time I remember, which is closest to the one we've got, is the 1970s. In the 1970s, if you recall, we were forming a new relationship with Europe because we'd just joined. We had an energy crisis that led to the lights being turned out. We had a fuel crisis, and so petrol rationing was threatened, right? We had the IMF tell us we had to change the way that we behaved. We had an oil crisis. We actually worried enormously. I can remember the worry with my own children. We worried that there was going to be a Third World War any minute, right? Now, we didn't have a pandemic, but apart from that, we had very, very similar. I worked for the ILEA as the Deputy Education Officer, and so rapid was inflation that I was entitled to free school meals for my children. God knows what it must have been like for the parents in Clapham. In other words, there has been a period not dissimilar. Now, the really interesting thing about the 1970s, from an education point of view, is that if you look at it, it marks a period of doubt and disillusion, undoubtedly fueled by all those indicators that I've just talked about. And after the war, you remember the Beveridge report? Well, in education, we were all marching to get rid of ignorance, which was one of the 5 great evils. And that's what we were going to slay. We were going to slay ignorance. And it was a period of enormous optimism and trust between the different people. And it was an extraordinary period of hope where everybody was united and there wasn't much party difference. And then during the 70s, the doubt and disillusion spread in, I think, for some of those reasons. And we launched into a different period. It was a period of belief in markets, in competition. And then as the markets brought as many failures as they brought success, more and more centralization, destroy local democracy. And that's what successive governments have done. And then, gosh, you are hopeless. So we need to tell you exactly what to do. So managerialism, keep getting directives from the DFE, telling you exactly what to do during a pandemic, probably quite often, or telling you in an 84-page document how to read, how to teach reading, as if you really needed that at that very moment. Now, I think people have got to the point, and your reference to Fed and your reference to the Times Education Commission, absolutely right. We're ready for a new period, and that's the breakwater. So for me, we need to be pushing, all of us, for saying there needs to be a 10-year plan for education, just as the Times Education Commission said. And that will be a way of lifting things and changing things. And we need to make sure that we enter a period of hope, collaboration, and really ambition, you know, because we haven't been ambitious enough. So that's what I think, and I think that if you look back on the London Challenge, which was sort of from about 2002 to 2011, we did change things. We made loads of mistakes. One of the big mistakes we made is that we didn't involve the Mayor of London. At that stage, it was Livingston. And there was a huge argument between Livingston and the Labour Party.
Can you give a brief overview as to what that was, the London Challenge? For those.
The London Challenge was, people said that London schools were performing worse than anywhere else in the country. And we were approached, I was approached, because I was working in Birmingham and had been for 10 years. And things have got better. Could you do in London? So we actually did the same sort of thing. We encouraged collaboration and partnerships between schools. We looked at the data. And most importantly of all, we balanced appreciative inquiry with problem solving. Now, I don't know if everybody knows about appreciative inquiry and problem solving, but it's absolutely crucial to the health of any organisation, any school. You need 3 parts of appreciative inquiry, which is looking at what's good, dialoguing for how it could be even better, and then deciding on an action plan. And problem solving, I know you've got plenty of them. Analyse the causes, work out what possible solutions are, and try and get on with it, right? And the argument, and it's 2 psychologists who've done this, is that you need 3 parts of appreciative inquiry for every part of problem solving, because it gives you energy to tackle the problems. You certainly don't want ensuring compliance, which is a third model, which is, you know what the answer is, you prescribe a single solution, you regulate and inspect, and you punish the deviants and the inadequates. I think you'll be familiar with that. You don't want that, and actually that's what we've got to. We've got to a wrong balance between those 3 things nationally. We need to change them. Sorry, I've gone on, I'll shut up.
No, it's brilliant, it's brilliant. Round of applause, please. An absolute legend, and it's wonderful to just hear that there was a problem that you managed to solve in this way through the London Challenge. It looks like we'll need a sort of nationwide challenge to get things up to standard soon. I've got one more question for you both, and then we're going to ask our audience for their questions. Back to you, Sir Tim. What can be done to insulate children's educational outcomes from macroeconomic and political forces?
Well, get to the mayors, because you can't insulate them entirely from politics. I mean, it's no good sort of pretending we can take it out of politics. Right. What you could do would be to have a standing framework commission for schools, the great and the good, the people in this room, teachers, faith leaders, CBI, unions, the lot. Bring them together and hammer out a 10-year plan. And then say to the Secretaries of State, who incidentally, we're governed in a country where Secretaries of State, not merely in education, last less than 2.5 years and have no job description and get the job with less than 12 hours notice and are looking to the next career post before they move on. Not a good way of running. If you had a 10-year plan, broadly agreed, Secretary of State could refer to it, could change it, but they'd have to explain why they were doing something different. Yeah. And that would remove part of the problem that we have at the moment.
I'd love to see a pension-style triple lock. You know, the politicians love to speak about this. Where's the triple lock for our children, right? Jehan, what changes do you want to see to support the children you serve so they can thrive?
So I was talking about this with our head of school yesterday, and actually I think our biggest thing is the infrastructure around school. So we rely heavily to meet those needs that I spoke about earlier and to address these issues before we can attend to what we know in school and what we're there to do. But the added extras, the things that are coming in, they're hungry, they don't have adequate housing, all of these things, health, well-being, that has an infrastructure around it. Social care, ever-changing, almost as much as the politicians. It doesn't feel safe around us. And I think that's one of our biggest issues at the moment, that we're fulfilling roles that actually aren't our sort of, we're not best placed to do that.
Going beyond.
We're doing what we can.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean we're the best people to be doing that. And are we affecting change in the way that some of those mainstream services could be if the infrastructure around us was safe enough? And not having to live term by term. You know, we're looking at things like therapeutic intervention for children that are severely traumatised, have been massively affected by pandemic. We can't say we're going to offer you that for the rest of this academic year. We have to say you can do this for the next 6 weeks, and then we'll have to see what we might need to do. You know, we might need to then use that money to fund someone a breakfast club space. So it's hand to mouth in school.
You know, of those three things you talked about, poverty, place and power, I think the biggest one is place. You really, really need to bring agencies together in your area, and because you can't do it alone, as you've said, and really put the housing right. I mean, why can't we get somebody like Hamlin or Esme Fairbairn or indeed Roundtree to bring some resources together and go for one place in the country where you really try to get the housing right, the employment right, the education right, and above all, multi-professional interventions right.
Well, I hope you're going to our next session on place, Sir Tim.
Use it up nicely.
And I'll just say that they're not in a silo, right? Because what you're talking about is place and poverty, and how do you have a contextualized solution to poverty? And so all of these things are tied up together.
Yeah. Thank you. Now over to you. Please think of some questions for our fantastic panelists. We've got roving mics, so just raise your hand. We've got one over there. Thank you. Madam, please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hiya, my name's Sonia Christensen from Children's University Trust, carrying on the work that Sir Tim Brighouse started many years ago. I just wanted to ask you whether you think, looking back to the time when you started Children's University Trust, whether we're actually in a worse place now than we were back then, educationally for children?
I think more, I don't think we're in a worse place than then, because I think that we could not have brought a group like this together at that time. I mean, I was reflecting as I came in that when I started out in my career, if you really wanted to make a difference to society, you joined the public services of one sort or another to give something back. And that was actually what motivated people. I think the voluntary sector, the third sector, has now become the place where people who want to do that really find their location. So it seems to me that there are many, many more organisations than there were then who want to change the system. But the danger is that unless you have the work of something like your present FEA, your efforts individually won't add up sufficiently, the sum, whatever it is, the sum of the parts, you know, the whole being more than the sum of the parts. So it seems to me that in many ways you've got plenty of reason to be more hopeful than you have to be pessimistic, notwithstanding the terrible stories that you're describing, because I think we're on the edge of a sea change.
I hope so. We need it. Any more questions for our panelists? We've got a question back there. Thank you, madam.
Thank you. Sorry,
Hello.
I'm really bad at speaking in front of lots of people, so if I screw up this question, I'm sorry.
You're great. You're doing great.
So I just had a question for Jehan, which was about, for the volunteers that we work with, what do you think moving into and kind of continuing into the cost of living and the kind of pandemic issues that we're facing, what would be the kind of 3 solid bits of advice that you think we could share with the volunteers we work with to support the young people we're trying to help? If that makes sense.
Three bits of advice for...
3 bits of advice for volunteers.
Yeah.
Are the volunteers specifically working in schools, out of schools?
Sorry. Yeah, so in schools is my volunteers, but I'm sure there'll be plenty of us who work outside of schools.
I go back to the bit that was mentioned this morning about the report as well, is that it's well-being, it's the understanding. I think that's the first port at the moment, really. We've got to start with well-being. We've got to look at what's going on for them. Are their basic needs being met? We can't talk about, you know, as an example, we have action tutoring in our school. It's a fantastic resource, it's great, we can provide that. However, a child can't sit through a tuition session with somebody trying to support them to bridge the gap to, enhance their academic achievement if they're hungry, tired, and living in inadequate housing or not well. So I think understanding would be the first one, looking at the wider context. We've mentioned well-being and involving families beyond the school gates. That's been spoken a lot about today. That's definitely key. I think this was mentioned earlier as well, not one size fits all. So we're in a position where we've got to start looking at, we don't have an infrastructure that supports everybody, and you can refer everybody to one place and they'll be seen. Everybody's situation varies massively, and the discrepancies between socioeconomic background is huge as well, even within one school setting. And finally, I think just, belief. So it's that optimism, it's what Tim mentioned. We can't become despondent. We've got to think, actually, even if what we're starting with seems impossible, we've got, it's a starting point. Somebody's there, somebody's listening. And so we might not always be able to evidence an impact, but we are measuring it as best we can. We might not get immediate results. It might not be as simple as it was before. It will take time. We are coming out of a pandemic, but it will make a difference eventually. Yeah.
Thank you. Got to keep the faith. Please do introduce yourselves before you ask your question. Let's go to the center. The gentleman in the grey first, and then I'll come to the lady. Thank you.
Good morning, Cormac Healy from Business in the Community. My question, following on from Sir Tim's comment, that it seems like there's a real opportunity today with all these people gathered here. What would you like to see emerge from these conversations?
Nice pragmatic question there. What would you like to see as the result of today and all these wonderful people being here?
Well, I've mentioned one. I think you should campaign, the FEA should campaign to get those major trusts to come up with the idea. I mean, for heaven's sake, our Prime Minister. Did you know, by the way, that Stanley Baldwin, who was our Prime Minister in the 1930s, gave half his fortune to reduce the national debt, right? Which was so huge. And he did it very clearly because he wanted to become the leader of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister. And it did strike me, by the way, that the other day, that if Rishi Sunak is so rich, one of the things he could do would be to give half his fortune to the FEA, along with... Along with, I bet you that would prompt the Roundtree Trust and Hamlin and Esme Fairbairn to match the funding, and then you could move in. You really want to change a place. Move in, and I'll pick somewhere that maybe isn't represented here. Move into somewhere like Doncaster, right? And really have a go at transforming a place. And say, well, if we can do it with this resource, let's do it. Rather as they felt about the London Challenge, because they said, hell, it worked. Let's go and do it in other places. And by the way, it didn't work. And one of the reasons it didn't work in other places is because if you're going to move something that works in one context, there are two things you have to think about. You have to think about the horizontal differences and allow for them, and the vertical faithfulness of what you do. If you get the wrong person at a key position, it all gets, well, I won't use the word, but it doesn't work, right? And there is a super book called Evidence-Based Policy Making, a Practical Guide, by a woman called Nancy Cartwright, another American. They're wonderful people. And I just wish our government would read that book, because then they wouldn't muck up by believing that one size fits everyone. It doesn't fit everyone. So I'd be begging back to Business in the Community, who's always done really, really good stuff for young people. But I would say it's the place. I want to go for a place and get a change in a place, because then people would say, well, if you can do it in one place, we must do it in other places. And actually, Doncaster would be a good place to start. You want to start somewhere where you've got, it's quite a good local authority, so they're quite keen. It's in the north, levelling up. I mean, it's got lots going for it. Now, I know you would want it in Clapham, but you know what? You've got to start somewhere. Let's start somewhere and really make a difference.
You've got to start somewhere.
Watch your inbox for that letter. Rishi Sunak, funding place-based change, signed the letter. And I'm sure some of you are in Doncaster. You said you were going to choose a place where probably isn't represented in the room, but I'm quite sure Doncaster will be represented in the room.
Yeah?
Right? Yeah?
Oh,
Yep.
All right, wonderful.
Yes, NLT, definitely
Amazing.
Doncaster.
And by the way, one of the other things, very quickly, is if you look at our history, we've had a go at changing places. So the education priority area thing in the 1960s and 70s started in Doncaster, which was then part of the West Riding and North Nottinghamshire. So they had a go there. And then there were education action zones, and then there was Justin Greening, who did those opportunity areas. The problem is that when government have done things like that, they've only tackled one bit of it. They've not tackled housing, they've not tackled employment, and they haven't brought the whole thing together. And really, that's what's desperately needed. So in a way, they've realised they should have done something, but they work in silos rather than together.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to come to this lady in the center, the scarf, and then I'll take another question as well, so we'll bundle them.
Yeah, so I was going to say Blackpool is where we need to start that work. I'm Sarah Smith, and I'm the Programmes Director for Right to Succeed in Blackpool, and I just wanted a show of hands of anyone else whose organisations are working in Blackpool. Yes,
well,
excellent.
you see plenty of things happening in Blackpool, whereas there are only a couple in Doncaster.
But my question is, how do we shift more of the funds and the money to the places that really are the highest levels of poverty in this country? I was a fundraising director for many years in London, so I know what it takes to get money together. But the challenge when you step outside of somewhere which has that depth of philanthropy and that sort of trust and relationship, comparatively when you get to other bits of the country, is like incomparable. So how are we going to shift that to make sure that the poorest places with the least connections are getting the funds that they need because they face the biggest challenges?
Thank you. Hold on the answers. We'll take one more question with that. Yes, to the lady behind in the denim shirt. Can't see from here. You look good, though.
Hi, thank you. Claudia Sumner from Child Poverty Action Group. Slightly devil's advocate, but since we are talking about place and we are in London, have been talking about London, London is sometimes presented as a place where the streets are paved with gold, and obviously there's some of the richest people on the planet live here. We have great transport, but we also have the highest level of child poverty in the country. And I wondered why, given all the interventions like London Challenge and so forth, why do we still have such persistently high levels of child poverty in London? Wasn't it working?
Okay. So if I'm remembering correctly, first question is on targeted fundraising for areas outside of London like Blackpool. Second question is on the persistence, stubborn persistence of child poverty right here in our capital. Please help.
Are you asking me or are you?
We're asking you.
Oh,
the first one we're asking you. Areas outside of London, was it? Targeted?
Well,
targeted?
one of the problems, I mean, it is a political question, the first one, because, for instance, if you looked at the school funding formula, which is called a fair funding formula, and you stand for fair things, actually it's an unfair funding formula they're introducing, because they're taking money from the poorest areas and they're giving them to the areas that traditionally couldn't be bothered to fund state education properly. And I know because I was for 10 years in Oxfordshire and they really starved the schooling system, despite me kind of trying to get resources. And then I went to Birmingham and realised that the world could be a different place as far as resources are concerned. And it seems to me that is a big political issue. And in a way, that's why I welcomed levelling up, because it suddenly seemed that there would be a bipartisan approach to set levelling up. And so I really feel that's hugely important. Why? Well, one of the reasons that poverty persists in London is the flip side of one of the reasons why London has profited in education. It's profited in education. There are many reasons for it. Part of the London Challenge was that we founded Teach First, and it helped enormously. As everybody knows, there are loads of Teach Firsters in the room. And that made a difference because it attracted people with energy, and it disproportionately affected people who wanted to go into teaching all over the country. So it suddenly became in university circles, well, if you wanted to do something, you might become a teacher, even if it was only for a bit. And it made a big difference. So that helped. And the other thing that helped in London is that, look, if you have lots of inward migration from different countries, you know, people who've got the get up and go to go across the world in order to get a better future for their children, those parents are very, very supportive parents. And if they're then gradually plunged into poverty because of unequal distribution of resources, and I'm afraid we do live in a society that seems to find it very difficult. I mean, you know, if you were in Sweden and you're a tax collector, you're regarded as one of the highest privileged occupations that there are. Whereas here people talk about tax. I mean, do we talk about equity taxes? We should. Our language matters. The language you use every day makes a difference to those kids, doesn't it? Each day. So why does poverty continue in London? Because we live in an unequal society and don't seem prepared to I should be paying more tax. How is it that I got my higher education free and my allowances free? Why did I get mortgage relief? Why have I got an index-linked pension, which I have? And why, in that case, aren't I paying a graduate tax? I should be paying a graduate tax. So our society doesn't really seem to care sufficiently about making sure that we give a bit more so you aren't facing those terrible conditions each day. Not you, but those poor children and their families.
Thank you. Amazing. Excellent. Janeen?
Thank you. It's really moving. We all just need to care. We're going to move on to discussion on tables. So here are the two questions up for you to discuss in pairs or, depending on table numbers, in threes. And it's just going to be for 5 minutes, so really quick. What does your organization need to do to respond to the context we've discussed this morning? And then what do we as a collective need to do to respond? And for each pair or three, put the answer to the second one in Menti. And I'm sorry if you hate getting on your phone right now, but it will only take a minute, so you can scan the QR code or go to menti.com and put in the code there. Either way. But one person in every discussion just needs to do it and put your answer to that second question in. And off you go for 5 minutes. So we've got some results up here, but so maybe we could just call on some volunteers from the audience to talk about what they put in there and what we need to do as a collective to respond to the context. Do we have, do we have a mic on this side? Thanks. Becca's running.
All right.
Thank you, Becca. And I'm John McMahon from the RSA, Royal Society for the Arts. We were talking a bit about the kind of assets and the key figures that exist within the network for FEA. So, for example, my new chief executive is the former chief economist of the Bank of England. He wrote the Levelling Up white paper. These people within our network have incredible kind of access, power to influence, power to convene as well. So that opportunity we have to bring together those partners to leverage in that space is incredibly powerful, I think, and we're really excited about how we can play a part as a sort of founder organisation within the FEA network.
We'll absolutely take you up on that. Thank you. And there's loads about collaboration and learning from each other, not duplicating and sharing best practice up there, which goes right to the heart of why we exist. And a few about local hubs, set up local projects in various areas of the UK. But is there anyone else who kind of wanted to jump in? Becca, we've got one over here. Or Naomi.
Hi, my name is Aziz Manor. I'm co-founder of 2 to 3 Degrees. This table really inspired me, and I really wanted to share because of what Tim mentioned earlier, and that sense of hope. So a lot of the discussion was around sharing data of the great work that we already do to really inspire people from different regions across England and the UK about how they can become the best versions of themselves and become the lived experience in these areas to be able to make change. And the thing that really struck me was the conversation we had about changing the narrative about how you can help the community and equip young people with the aspiration and inspiration to change their communities. So not always by talking about, oh, let's go out doing fundraising and ask for money, or let's not put extra pressure on young people and parents to go paying for like a ski trip, but actually, how can the young people themselves be inspired and equipped with the tools to be able to change their local community in the way that best serves them and their local families and other people as well. So I was really inspired by that.
Can I just add to that about trips? Don't get me started on trips. I don't know. Growing up, trips didn't seem to be so complex. They didn't seem to be such a complex thing. They are now like basically the select few. So without additional support from outside of school, children don't go on trips.
Look, can I just come in and say simply, there is one reform. You know the triple lock? You've heard of the triple lock, right? And there's a great argument about will they or won't they abandon the triple lock in due course. During the terrible 1970s, the one thing that the government was held to account for was that the real terms funding of the schooling system had to be maintained. And there was a thing called an expenditure steering group for education, which sat all the time and held them and the Treasury to account. And as a result, there were all sorts of, it was terribly difficult to get to grips on inflation, but it did mean that schooling funding held well. Now, I'll tell you something, that in 2010, the cost of paying for a day private independent school was twice that of the state school after 10 years of increasing the funding for state schools. Clapham Manor, right? Now it is 3 times, right? The very simple campaign that if every MP's surgery had it on a Friday and you went in and said it should happen, is they should establish an index of the cost of a bag of independent schools and say it's 19,000 quid and you're 7,000 quid. Let's make sure that there's a commitment that it doesn't get any wider. So that then, because what happens in the independent sector, I'll tell you now, that if the costs go up, they put the fees up, right? So it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and unfairness blossoms. Now, if we're committed to a fair education alliance and fair education for all, the least the government could do would be to establish an index that linked so it doesn't get wider.
Yeah, okay.
All good?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, wow, what a panel. What a start. Please join me in thanking my brilliant panelists. So Tim, Jehan.